On August 12th of 1986, a woman's body was found in a swamp in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The woman had been assaulted and strangled. She was quickly identified as 22-year-old Lisa Holstead. Lisa had a 5-year-old son named Jeremy. Investigators collected a DNA sample from her body belonging to the person that took her life. Other than the DNA sample, investigators did not have much to go on, and the case went cold. In 2018, a DNA profile could be created for the sample. Green Bay investigators then sent the profile to a DNA testing company. The company made use of genetic genealogy to create a list of relatives of the suspect. Investigators were then able to narrow it down until they finally found a man who they believed was responsible. Green Bay Police Detective David Graff described the process as basically doing a family tree in reverse. Even though investigators were sure they identified the man they were looking for, they had to be 100% sure. On September 15th of 2020, investigators collected beer cans and cigarettes that were used by the suspect. These items were then sent for DNA testing. The results of these tests confirmed that this man's DNA matched the DNA that was found at the crime scene. His name is Lou Griffin. He has a long history of violence against women and children. Griffin was arrested in 1981 for an unrelated crime. This was unfortunately before police started collecting DNA. In 1986, when he took Lisa's life, he was in the Green Bay area because he was out on parole. On October of 2020, 65-year-old Griffin was arrested for what he did to Lisa. He was taken to the Brown County Jail. Lisa's son, Jeremy, who was just 5 years old when his mother's life was taken, had this to say about the arrest. "I just want closure. It's the same thing the whole family wanted for the last 34 years. I wish my grandma was alive to be able to see this. Sometimes I'm happy. Sometimes, I get a little more sad. I don't really know how to explain it," he says. "You don't want to get your hopes way up high to have them come crashing down, but I feel pretty good overall about it." Unfortunately, Lisa's mother passed away a few years ago, never learning who took her daughter's life. The judge set a cash bond of $1 million. Griffin's court hearing was set for December 10th of 2020. In February of 2021, Griffin wrote a letter to a local television station where he claimed that his rights had been violated. According to him, investigators were falsely accusing him of the crime. He also raised an issue with his $1 million bond. He said that he is a 65-year-old who has ties to the community for more than 40 years. Griffin's trial started in late 2022. On January 27th of 2023, Lou Griffin pleaded no contest in court. A judge then found him guilty. He will be sentenced on March 27th of 2023. "12-year-old Brad Bellino lived in Youngstown, Ohio in 1972. He was the youngest of 4 children and enjoyed playing baseball. On March 31st of 1972, Brad left a friend's home in the Applewood Acres neighborhood, but never returned to his home, which was located on McClurg Road. Police immediately started to search for Brad when his parents reported him missing. A few days after he was last seen, on April 4th of 1972, his body was found by a trash collector in a dumpster by the Isales in Boardman Plaza. An autopsy determined that Brad had been assaulted and was strangled with a belt that was still around his neck. In spite of police reports of possible leads in the case, help from a psychologist and a $2,000 reward, investigators were unable to identify who was responsible. Don Templeman was Brad's best friend and the last person to see him alive after he left his home in March of 1972. Templeman and Brad were inseparable, even going to the same school, having sleepovers, and playing on the same sports teams. "When we started playing baseball together, I was the pitcher. He was the catcher, and my dad was the coach," Templeman said. Many of those days ended with a family dinner at Templeman's house, which also was the case the last day of Brad's life. In the days to follow Brad's disappearance, Templeman's fears were confirmed by a teacher during a math class. "I have some news. The Bellino boy has been found," said Templeman. Everyone cheered and was excited, but then she said, "But he's dead." Boardman police officer Robert Rupp was the one who first arrived at the crime scene and who investigated the case. "I vowed at that time I'd work very hard to find out what happened to him. I thought about that case every day of my life, even after I retired," Rupp said. On January 24th of 2023, Boardman police held a news conference to announce that Brad Bellino's case had been solved. The suspect has been identified as Joseph Norman Hill. He passed away in 2019 of natural causes. Hill was 32 years old at the time of the crime. No link could be found between Hill and the Bellino family. Hill lived on Shadyside Drive in Boardman at the time, but moved to Yucaipa, California in 1978, where he resided until his passing in July of 2019. During his time in Boardman, Hill was a truck driver for a bottled water company. 2 other cold cases involving missing teens occurred during Hill's time in Boardman. These cases include one of 15-year-old Thomas Baird, who was found on Lake Park Road in 1970, and one of 13-year-old David Evans, who went missing in January of 1975. 6 days later, Evans's body was found frozen in the bushes of a parking lot. It is now being investigated if Hill was responsible for any other crimes. Police say they were able to identify Hill as the culprit because his DNA was found on Brad's clothes. This is a case that dominated the headlines for years after it happened, and now it's finally solved. "32-year-old Felicia McGuyer lived in Suffolk County, Massachusetts in 2007. She had a 10-year-old son and was dating 17-year-old David Pena. Felicia was last seen on October 7th of 2007 in the area of Roxton Street in Boston's Dorchester neighborhood. She was reported missing by her mother 10 days later. Multiple witnesses reported suspicious activity by Pena in the hours and days after her disappearance. Pena told investigators in 2007 that he was involved in a physical confrontation with Felicia, and she stabbed him with scissors. He said he left their apartment, but when he returned a few days later, Felicia and her possessions were gone. Pena said that he believed she went to Florida to be with an ex-boyfriend. Neighbors told investigators that they did see Pena with a wound that night, and a few days later they said they saw Pena and a man who is believed to be his brother at about 4 a.m. They were struggling to carry what appeared to be a bulky, rolled-up, multicolored blanket. There was one person at each end of the rolled-up blanket. The men were seen putting the rolled-up carpet and blanket into the back of a car and driving away at a high rate of speed. Police dedicated a lot of resources and spent a lot of time searching for Felicia, but her body was never found. There was also not enough evidence to charge David Pena with any crime, so the case went cold for some time. In 2017, a search was conducted in the wooded area of West Roxbury, Massachusetts for Felicia, but nothing substantial was found. Also, in 2017, another witness came forward to talk to investigators. He said David Pena asked him to help remove items from the apartment he and Felicia shared, including a rolled-up carpet that was difficult to carry. The witness who helped carry the rolled-up carpet said that he immediately thought that there was a body wrapped up in the carpet and blanket. Furthermore, the witness said they carried what he believed was Felicia's body into a wooded area with a parking lot in the Boston area. Once in the wooded area, the witness claimed to have seen that it was in fact Felicia's body. On January 17th of 2023, 33-year-old David Pena was arrested in Florida. He was already in custody on an unrelated matter. Police also discovered there was another warrant for his arrest on cocaine trafficking charges. District Attorney Kevin Hayden had this to say: "Information leading to Pena's arrest was developed through interviews conducted since Felicia McGuyer's disappearance, with the latest taking place in March of 2022. Pena is currently in a Dorchester prison in Massachusetts. He is scheduled to go to court on February 17th of 2023 for a probable cause hearing. Felicia's family members were in court for his arraignment but did not comment on Pena's arrest. We haven't talked in 15 years. We're not going to talk today. There's a reason for that." In June and July of 1984, 4 separate women were violated and assaulted by one man in Connecticut. The 4 victims were never publicly named and only became known as Jane Doe 1, 2, 3, and 4. All 4 victims reported being blindfolded and assaulted inside their homes by an unidentified assailant. All of them reported their attacker rummaging through their personal belongings, eating food from their refrigerators, and leaving faucets running. Investigators linked the 4 crimes because the DNA collected at the crime scenes belonging to the suspect showed that only one man was responsible. Unfortunately, DNA was not advanced enough back in 1984 to identify this unknown assailant. The crimes took place in Windsor, Bloomfield, Middletown, and Rocky Hill, Connecticut. Over the years, leads dried up or failed to materialize as detectives tirelessly hunted down any clues as to who could have been behind the crimes. Investigators caught a break in 2020 when DNA technology implicated Michael Sharpe in the cold cases. DNA evidence collected from crime scenes, including linens, laundry clothes, and towels, ultimately matched Sharpe and tied him to the crime scenes. DNA recovered from his trash by investigators proved that he was indeed responsible. In November of 2020, 69-year-old Michael Marion Sharpe of Marlborough, Connecticut, was arrested. With this arrest, the victims of these crimes, who have waited more than 3 decades to see their attacker brought to justice, now know he will be held accountable for his crimes, Chief State's Attorney Richard Colangelo said in a statement. Turning to forensic genetic genealogy as a possible breakthrough for unsolved cases shows that the cold case unit's investigators never forget the victims of these crimes. Supervisory Assistant State's Attorney John F. Fahey, head of the cold case unit, said in a statement after Sharpe was arrested. Sharpe was once a chief executive officer of a group that ran the Jamoki Academy, a tuition-free charter school in Hartford. Sharpe's trial began in November of 2022 in the Hartford Superior Court. 3 of the women were in the courtroom, while the 4th took part via video conference. All 4 testified about being attacked in their bedrooms in the middle of the night and how they suffered lifelong trauma. Relatives of Sharpe also testified and asked Judge Frank Diodabo for leniency. Police said they were led to Sharpe in 2020 because his relatives had given DNA samples to the GED Match website. DNA samples taken from trash outside Sharpe's home and later from his cheeks matched the DNA found at the crime scenes. Forensic experts told the jury that there was a 1 in 7 billion chance that the DNA belonged to somebody else other than Sharpe. The first victim, a 25-year-old woman living at an apartment in Bloomfield, reported she'd been burglarized and assaulted by a male perpetrator on June 3rd of 1984. She told law enforcement she'd been sleeping in her bedroom when Sharpe entered her dwelling. The intruder placed his hand over my mouth and told me not to scream or he would shoot me and my roommate. Sharpe was convicted on all 8 kidnapping charges that had been brought against him after a 5-day trial, where a state jury in Hartford deliberated for less than 1 hour before delivering their unanimous verdict. He could not be charged with assault because there was a 5-year statute of limitations at the time. Kidnapping charges, though, have no such limit. Sharpe then apologized to the women, but he said that he has memory problems and had no recollection of the crimes. "I don't know what happened. I don't know. But I'm so sorry," he said. "You deserve so much better. No one should ever come into your home and violate you. If I was this person, if I was this monster, I hope that he is dead inside of me after that 2 months of my life." On January 9th of 2023, 71-year-old Sharpe received a 72-year sentence for his role. Judge Frank M. Diodabo, who handed down the sentence in a Hartford courtroom, imposed a minimum of 40 years behind bars. The judge compared the pain Sharpe's victims endured to lifelong sentences. The 4 women would forever be haunted by the agonizing trauma he inflicted. The judge described Sharpe as a predator. "You fit that definition," said the judge in court. "A person who ruthlessly exploits others." Today's sentencing shows that years of hard work and collaboration among multiple agencies in the pursuit of justice can finally lead to a successful result, Chief State's Attorney Patrick Griffin said. The investigators and prosecutors in the Cold Case Unit never give up on these difficult cases and look to the latest advances in forensic science and other technologies to help solve them. Our hope is that this prison sentence brings some measure of peace to all the brave women who testified at the trial. Sharpe had this to say after the sentencing. "I just don't know how I could have possibly done something so monstrous," Sharpe told his victims. Sharpe had indicated he'd vowed to leave it up to the jury to determine whether I'm this monster. "And they said I was," Sharpe added. "And so I'm going to have to live by that." "50-year-old Tammy Sellers Holland lived in Randolph County, North Carolina in 2014. She worked as a waitress at Elizabeth's Pizza on Liberty Drive in Thomasville for over a decade. Tammy lived alone in a mobile home on Laughlin Hill Road. On October 28th of 2014, after noticing her car was still in the driveway when she normally would be at work, neighbors went to check on Tammy. There was no immediate response. When neighbors later returned to the house, a dog appeared in the window, which caused the curtains to move. Neighbors then spotted Tammy on the floor and called 911 just after 2 a.m. Officers who arrived on the scene confirmed that Tammy was not alive anymore. The autopsy revealed that she had been stabbed multiple times. Detectives interviewed the neighbors and collected forensic evidence from the crime scene. Unfortunately, no useful leads presented themselves and the case went cold. Co-workers and hundreds of customers who Tammy served throughout the years said that her not being there anymore was a loss that left a hole in the restaurant and a hole in their hearts. The community put together a memorial for her. The front counter was filled with pictures and displayed an apron belonging to Tammy. At the time, manager Gino DePorto said, "We feel like we want to pay some respect to her. We want to make sure everybody knows we miss her." DePorto added that Tammy was a great, great person who was like family. She was here every day, happy, had a good personality and never got mad, always respected everybody, loved the cooks in the back, always worked together with the cooks and never took a day off unless she was sick. On February 7th of 2023, 50-year-old Roy Lee White was arrested on charges of a felony accessory. It was determined by detectives of the Randolph County Sheriff's Office that White's wife, Florence Elizabeth Keene, was responsible for taking Tammy's life. Keene and White lived near Tammy. Florence Keene passed away in 2018. White gave investigators a detailed breakdown of how Keene committed the crime and how he helped. Unfortunately, details have not been made public regarding a motive and what led investigators to Keene and White. Roy White is currently in the Randolph County Detention Center and was given a $60,000 bond and is awaiting his first appearance in court. Sonia Carmen Herok Stone was a 30-year-old single mother living with her 4-year-old daughter in Monterey County, California in 1981. She worked as a merchandiser and sales representative for Levi Strauss & Company. On October 15th of 1981, a friend of Sonia, Caroline McBride, knocked on her front door. When Sonia didn't answer, McBride made her way inside. It was then that she found Sonia's partially clothed body sprawled on the floor of the living room. She had been strangled with a pair of pantyhose. Several pieces of DNA evidence were collected from the crime scene by investigators to be used later. Investigators decided to make a timeline of the crime. They believed her life was taken while her young daughter was at school. It was around noon when her body was found. Soon after the crime took place, a man told investigators that he had a friend who admitted to being inside Sonia's house the morning that her life was taken. The friend's name is Michael Glazebrook, Sonia's neighbor. A day after the crime occurred, investigators decided to interview him. They saw that he had a scratch on his face and was extremely nervous. On December 18th of 1981, he was arrested in connection to the case. In 1983, he was tried, but the jury could not agree on his innocence or guilt. Prosecutors dropped the case following a mistrial. In the early 1980s, DNA evidence was a long way off. Blood was found under Sonia's fingernails, but lab technicians could only tell that it did not belong to her. In 2020, investigators decided to re-examine the case. They tested the DNA evidence they had collected back in 1981 all over again. They were then able to create a DNA profile. Because they still believed Michael Glazebrook was involved, they collected his DNA sample. After some more testing, it was confirmed that Michael Glazebrook is responsible for taking the life of Sonia. 65-year-old Glazebrook was arrested at his home in Seaside, California in August of 2021. He worked as a school bus driver, which is just absolutely terrifying. Glazebrook found himself in the Monterey County Jail, where he was held in lieu of bail set at $1 million. Michael Glazebrook was convicted of the crime on February 8th of 2023. He is scheduled for sentencing on April 26th, when he faces a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mary Prieur and her husband Leonard lived in Flint, Michigan. They owned Sweet Marie's candy store for many years before selling it. They then moved to Lennon, Michigan to retire. In 1990, Leonard passed away. In the years since his passing, Mary became a fixture in the small village. She was a devout Catholic and often attended church functions. Lennon residents remember seeing her walk from home to the town diner for lunch and dinner most days. On February 27th of 1997, Michigan State Police K-9 teams taking part in training in the area found 88-year-old Mary's body in a wooded area near her residence. She had been beaten, strangled, and assaulted. It was a crime that shocked the small Lennon community. Investigators collected DNA at the crime scene that belonged to the suspect. They also conducted hundreds of interviews to gain evidence in the case and followed up on dozens of leads. Quickly, they zeroed in on Michael Burr. He lived in a residence a short walk from Mary's house. He was in the 11th grade at the time. Investigators took his DNA sample so it could be stored, as DNA was not advanced enough at the time to confirm that his DNA matched what was found at the crime scene. Unfortunately, investigators could not gather enough evidence to meet the probable cause standard necessary to charge him in connection with the case. Recently, the Genesee County Police Department partnered up with the Michigan State Police Crime Lab to finally help solve the case. In November of 2021, they were able to match the DNA found at the scene to that of Michael Burr. Genesee County Prosecutor David Layton said that DNA evidence shows 1 in 1.9 octillion chance that Michael was not responsible for what happened to Mary. Ultimately, what we want here is closure for the victim's family, he said. We want closure because when you lose a loved one in such a brutal manner, it never goes away from your mind. You never have a peaceful day when you can stop thinking about it. Michael Burr was then held in the Genesee County Jail without bond. He had a probable cause hearing in Genesee County District Court on November 24th of 2021, where prosecutors laid out the evidence against him. This case was wrapped up on February 3rd of 2023, when Michael Burr was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson had this to say after the sentencing. Although Mary was not related to me by blood, my family grew up with her. I was assigned this case as a young detective sergeant, and 21 years later, here we are. When you see people come forward and allow families to have answers to questions, especially in such a violent case like this is why we clip the heels and take the oath. This is why we become police officers and investigators, he added. Although I don't have the same relationship that the family behind me has with Mary, Mary's my family and it's a great day. "82-year-old Opal Weil lived in Pinellas County, Florida in 1987. She lived alone near her brother and sister-in-law and was visited often by family. Therefore, it was unusual when Opal did not pick up the phone the morning of February 9th of 1987, after her sister-in-law had called her. Believing Opal was out for a routine walk, the sister-in-law called her every 5 minutes. Still, no answer. The sister-in-law dropped by, discovering that the kitchen nightlight was still on, which was odd because Opal routinely turned it off when she woke up by 6 a.m. Then the sister-in-law found a window pane that had been removed from a door leading into the room. It was leaning against an exterior wall. Inside, the sister-in-law made a tragic discovery. Opal's body in a bedroom. She had blood around her mouth, bruising to her face, and ligature marks around her neck. Investigators, who arrived at the crime scene, discovered that a ground wire for a telephone line was cut, though it did not disrupt the service. There were no fingerprints on the window pane, but there were leather or glove marks, and also scratch marks and pry marks were on the Florida room door near the latch. Investigators determined that several drawers appeared to have been hastily searched, with boxes being partially left open. That included a jewelry box left with the lid off and felt lining partially out of the box, and items including Opal's wedding ring were stolen. Hairs from the person investigators believed to be the suspect were recovered from Opal's home. Though investigators managed to develop a partial DNA profile, they did not get a match until after cold case detectives in December 2020 asked the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and Parabon Nanolabs to test again. Dr. Ellen Graytack, who works for Parabon, had this to say about the process. What we are able to do with that data is to put it into a genetic genealogy database, and places where people have chosen to put their DNA data and opted into a law enforcement matching. Our genealogists are able to build family trees and then go back in time because we know that sometime in the past they must have shared ancestors, so the trick is finding them. So you build those family trees back and find those ancestors and then look forward to see who is living now. Parabon managed to track down 3 brothers as potential suspects. Detectives ruled out 2, including one who is deceased. That left Mississippi man Michael Lipnowski. Detectives detectives began an undercover operation to confirm a forensic match, including collecting discarded red coffee straws and a restaurant spoon with Lipnowski's DNA, which matched the profile from the hairs at Opal's home. They were able to collect the restaurant spoon with the help of a Bay St. Louis Police Department detective who owned a restaurant and personally knew the suspect. As a part of the plan, he set up a local promotion offering a free meal, thanking local customers, and promoting the restaurant to residents. Investigators lured Lipnowski there with a flyer, and accordingly, they got a spoon and fork that he used. Lipnowski lived less than half a mile from Opal at the time of the crime in 1987. Speaking to investigators, Lipnowski denied being near her home during the time frame. He denied recognizing Opal, seeing her, talking to her, or being at her home. 55-year-old Michael Lipnowski Jr. was arrested in Mississippi on January 26th of 2023 and charged with taking Opal Weil's life. Dr. Joseph Seo is a professor of criminal justice at St. Leo University and said it's possible Lipnowski committed other crimes. He said detectives will now likely look here and across the country at other locations where Lipnowski has lived to see if he can be connected to other crimes. Connecting them isn't that difficult if you understand what you are looking for. Look for similarities that are not normal or natural, Seo said. In 1987, 4 days after Opal Weil's body was discovered in her home, Eleanor Swift's life was taken. 9 days later, 86-year-old Maria Els was attacked, but she survived. Detectives at the time thought the cases were connected. Now they will investigate to see if Lipnowski could be responsible. "78-year-old Mildred Matheny lived in Lake Worth, Florida in 1985. She suffered from dementia. Mildred was a retired nurse. On the evening of April 27th, a passerby discovered Mildred with life-threatening injuries. She was naked and bloody from blows to her head and face. Her discarded clothes were strewn around and her dentures were found in the dirt. She was taken to the hospital, but sadly, she succumbed to her injuries a few days later. Investigators tried to create a timeline. They found that Mildred was last seen at her home where she lived with her younger sister Gladys Nolan in the 1300 block of Crestwood Boulevard in Lake Worth Beach. Mildred then seemingly wandered off, and this was not the first time. At 4:30 p.m., she was reported missing. Then, at 10 p.m., she was found by the passerby lying on the ground in Old Indian Town Road in Jupiter, more than 30 miles from her home. Witnesses reported seeing Mildred get into a brown Oldsmobile sedan at the intersection of Dixie Highway and Lucerne Avenue. The witnesses told investigators that the man behind the wheel said he was Mildred's neighbor and was going to help get her home. What exactly happened between then and when she was found, they did not know. Frustratingly, without suspects or strong leads, the case went cold for many years. That was until recently. Investigators took the DNA of the suspect they collected from Mildred's body in 1985 and made use of genetic genealogy to identify him. In March of 2021, they identified him as 61-year-old Richard Curtis Lang. He lives in Boynton Beach, Florida, which is very close to where Mildred lived. He was then taken to Palm Beach County Jail without bond. He denied any involvement in the crime and hired a defense attorney. The attorney had this to say in a statement. Mr. Lang vehemently denies the allegations brought today by the Palm Beach County State's Attorney's Office, and we look forward to aggressively challenging the forensic evidence attributed to Mr. Lang. Nothing in Mr. Lang's past indicates a propensity for such abhorrent behavior, and given his age and health, we will argue that he should be released to home detention as we prepare for a trial. It is unclear how Mildred's path may have crossed with Richard, who was 25 years old at the time that the crime occurred. Richard, is a convicted felon. His DNA was uploaded to CODIS after his arrest on a weapons possession charge in 2012 in Palm Beach County. Despite him denying any involvement, investigators are sure that he is responsible. He is a convicted felon, lived in the area, and it's really hard explaining away the fact that his DNA was found inside of her body. Mildred's son had this to say following the arrest. "It's been a long time. I'm thankful to the cold case people for finding that dastardly SOB. He said that his mom had worked with psychiatric patients in a Little Rock hospital in Arkansas. She enjoyed sewing, cooking, and the company of family. On February 1st of 2023, 62-year-old Richard Lang was found guilty of taking Mildred's life and assaulting her. Lang, who was confined to a wheelchair and sometimes snored during slow parts of the trial, said nothing after the verdict as bailiffs escorted him from the courtroom. This finally closed the door on a 2-day trial and a 38-year-old cold case. Circuit Judge Delia Weiss is scheduled to sentence Lang to prison on April 4th of 2023. 27-year-old Sarah Mobley Hall lived in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1984 with her 10-year-old son, Derrick Mobley. Sarah, a single mother, worked with children with disabilities during the day. One of those special needs kids was Derrick. Everyone described Derrick as a very happy kid and friendly to everyone. On March 14th of 1984, Charlotte police officers discovered a horrific crime scene at Sarah's home on Ventura Way. Someone entered their home and brutally took the lives of both Sarah and Derrick. Autopsies concluded that both of them had been beaten and strangled. Detectives did a tremendous amount of work chasing down possible suspects, but the case went cold. Over the years, detectives revisited the case. In 1998, one of those investigators was Johnny Jennings. He was able to find DNA belonging to the suspect from items that were collected at the crime scene back in 1998. Unfortunately, DNA technology was not advanced enough back then to use DNA to identify the culprit. It was only recently, with genetic genealogy, that investigators could use the DNA to identify someone. After DNA testing, investigators were led to a person of interest in South Carolina. With the help of the FBI, Charlotte police got DNA samples from that person. He is 60-year-old James Thomas Pratt. Further testing confirmed that Pratt indeed was responsible for what happened to Sarah and Derrick Mobley. He was arrested on February 1st of 2023 at a hotel in York County, South Carolina. He was charged with taking their lives. He is in custody and being held without bail. Investigators said that Pratt and Sarah had been in a relationship, but did not elaborate on a motive or any other details about the case, saying it's part of an ongoing investigation. In a news conference announcing the arrest, Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department Captain Joel McNelly said that forensic DNA helped lead to the suspect in a case that many have long forgotten. Society has probably forgotten about these folks. It's been a long time, he added. A lot of things have happened, but the family never forgot, and we never forgot. There's been a family that's been waiting 39 years, wondering what has happened. You can imagine sitting for 4 decades, not knowing what happened to your sister, not knowing what happened to your nephew, and to have this resolution is really, really important for this family. Sarah's sister, Mary Day, had this to say: "It's so exciting to hear that after all these years, we are able to bring some closure. I'm just so grateful that the police have found this person, and I hope that he spends the rest of his days behind bars." Martha Marie Morrison was born in 1956 in Eugene, Oregon. She grew up in foster care. Martha attended Roosevelt High School in Portland and the Corvallis Farm School. Subsequently, she went to Arizona to participate in the Job Corps program. Martha had a history of drug use. and of running away from the homes of both her biological and foster families. She was last seen on September 1st of 1974, when she visited her family with a man who she shared an apartment with. Martha quarreled with the man and then disappeared. She was 17 years old at the time. About a month and a half after Martha was last seen on October 12th of 1974, human remains of 2 women were found in Dole Valley near Vancouver, Washington. After the remains were discovered, the bones of the victims were examined nationwide in hopes of identifying them. One of the victims was quickly identified via dental records as 18-year-old Carol Platt Valenzuela. Carol had been reported missing on August 4th of 1974 by her husband after she failed to return home after hitchhiking to Vancouver on August 2nd. Investigators hoped that her identification would perhaps increase the likelihood of identification for the second victim. They intended to question Carol's husband, but he was recovering from an aspirin overdose at the time. He was arrested, but eventually released after passing a polygraph test on October 25th of 1974. All examinations were unsuccessful in identifying the second victim. It could only be estimated that she was white and between 20 to 25 years old. Forensic facial reconstructions were created of the victim from both frontal and profile views and released through a newspaper, but it went unrecognized by the public. The victim's physical description was also listed, including the fact that she had curly textured hair and dental hygiene problems. She also appeared to have given birth at some point. Police returned to the scene following the initial discovery in order to possibly obtain more evidence. A new metal detector, borrowed from a Snohomish County resident, was also used, but did not deliver anything useful. Examination into the 2 victims showed that they were deceased for at least 2 weeks prior to being found. Decomposition and animal activity made it difficult to estimate the cause, but authorities always believed that someone took their lives. Several missing persons at the time were considered to be the second victim, including Patty Hearst, but she was later found alive. Several serial offenders, such as Gary Ridgway, Warren Leslie Forrest, and the guy on your screen whose name we can't say on YouTube, was linked to the case over the years. In 2012, investigators were able to create a DNA profile for the second victim, who was still unidentified. DNA was then collected from many family members who had a missing female relative. Martha Morrison's sister and half-brother gave a sample of their DNA, and it was used to develop a genetic profile to compare to potential matches. It was compared to the DNA of the second victim. Similarities were noted, but a definite match was not established. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, which specializes in locating missing people and identifying human remains, eventually got involved. In July of 2015, they were finally able to confirm that the second victim found was Martha Morrison. Investigators then focused again on finding the person responsible for taking the lives of Martha and Carol. They looked into Warren Leslie Forrest. He is currently incarcerated for taking the life of Krista K. Blake in July of 1974. Forrest was arrested on October 2nd of 1974, just 10 days before the bodies of Martha and Carol were found. Law enforcement officials conducted DNA testing on a bloodstain found on an air pistol that was owned by Forrest, which was previously believed to have belonged to a different woman, one of the 6 others that he attacked during his years at large. Results from the DNA testing confirmed in 2019 that it was Martha's blood on Forrest's gun. He also is a suspect in the 1974 disappearance of Diane Gilchrist and the 1971 disappearance of Jamie Grissom. 73-year-old Warren Forrest's trial started in 2023. He was found guilty of all the charges against him on February 1st, after the juries deliberated for just 90 minutes. He will be sentenced on February 17th of 2023. Investigators are still working on other cases to confirm whether Forrest was responsible for them too or not. 21-year-old Leslie Marie Perlov lived in Los Altos Hills, California. She was a Stanford University student and aspiring law student. She lived with her widowed mom and worked as a clerk at the North County Law Library. Leslie was last seen at her job on February 13th of 1973. When she did not arrive home, her mother Florence called the police. Leslie would always call if she would be late, so Florence immediately knew something was wrong. That same day, her 1972 orange Chevrolet Nova was discovered parked at the gate of an old quarry located near Old Page Mill Road. A few days after she was last seen, her body was found under an oak tree west of where her car was found. She had been strangled. Investigators were able to retrieve DNA from the crime scene that was left behind by the person who took her life. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen a blonde man near Leslie's car before she went missing. After an extensive investigation, detectives were no closer to solving the case, and it went cold. Then, in July of 2018, investigators learned about new advances in DNA that might help them solve the case. They submitted the DNA from the unknown male collected at the crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs. A DNA profile was then created, and using genetic genealogy, they were able to identify 74-year-old John Getro as the person who took Leslie's life. He had previously served time in Germany for assaulting and strangling 15-year-old Margaret Williams in 1964. Getro served nearly 6 years out of a 10-year sentence for assault with fatal consequences. He was released after idiotic officials determined he was likely to lead a righteous life. Investigators were able to confirm that Getro also took the life of Janet Ann Taylor using DNA in 2018. Janet's case is very similar to Leslie's. On March 24th of 1974, she visited her friends at Stanford University. That evening, 21-year-old Janet was seen walking along Junipero Serra Boulevard. The next morning, her body was found by a delivery driver. Her body had been dumped by a wooded area close to a bridge just off Sand Hill Road. Janet attended Canada College and was the youngest daughter of football legend and former Stanford coach Chuck Taylor. Investigators always believed that what happened to Leslie and Janet were connected, but only proved it in 2018. John Getro's trial was supposed to take place in 2020, but he fell ill and it was delayed. It is believed that he is responsible for more crimes and is still being investigated by the police. Leslie Perlov's sister Diane had this to say after hearing about the arrest. "I have been waiting for this call for 45 years, and now that it came, I am just a bit stunned. Not a day goes by that I do not think about Leslie in some way. She was my big sister, always looking out for me. She was and remains always with me." In September of 2021, John Getro's trial started for the Janet Taylor case. He was convicted of taking her life on September 14th. He was convicted on the strength of DNA evidence culled from a disposable coffee cup he used and then threw away in 2018. That sample was matched with DNA swabbed from the inside and outside of Janet Taylor's pants. On January 10th of 2023, John Getro formally pleaded guilty and admitted that he took Leslie Marie Perlov's life as well. Getro is currently scheduled to appear for his sentencing hearing on April 26th of 2023. Justice for Leslie Perlov and her loved ones took a very long time, but it has arrived. District Attorney Jeff Rosen said in a statement following the plea hearing, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. On June 5th of the year 2000, 54-year-old Sharon Anschutz was working at the John Butler Dry Cleaners located at 1710 Easley Bridge Road in Greenville, South Carolina. An unknown man entered the dry cleaners and fatally shot Sharon in what was later determined to be a robbery. Following the initial investigation, the case went cold after no arrests were made. Investigators were able to collect DNA from the crime scene, though, that they believed belonged to the suspect. In 2022, the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit began re-interviewing old witnesses and identifying new ones. In addition, investigators looked into potential forensic evidence related to the case. On January 6th of 2023, investigators closed the case after determining who they believed was the suspect, 44-year-old Roger Keith Hudgens. Officials say through interviews, investigators learned Hudgens was a local man who did various jobs around the dry cleaners, including occasionally taking out the trash. Through speaking with witnesses, investigators learned of Hudgens' intentions to rob the business that day and, along with forensic evidence, were able to tie him to the crime. Hudgens passed away in 2008 from medical complications, meaning there will be no justice. Greenville County Sheriff Hobart Lewis said this in a press release. While no investigation will bring loved ones back, I hope that Miss Sharon Anschutz's family can find peace in knowing that the culprit was identified and no longer in a position to harm others. As the sheriff of this county, it is my unwavering intention not to rest until every one of our cold cases is solved and justice is served. I am so proud of the work and persistent dedication our team of investigators performed. My message to the community of fallen victim families is that we will never give up. Not a lot of details are known about this next case, but on January 10th of 2023, Manatee County Sheriff's Office detectives in Florida arrested 40-year-old Pedro Garcia and charged him with taking the life of 37-year-old Guadelupe Vela in July of 2006. Detectives issued a press release on the arrest, which said Guadelupe and Garcia were rival gang members. They were at a Santa Fe bar when they began arguing. The two men took the argument outside before leaving in different directions. Guadelupe went to a relative's home in Bradenton, Florida. While there, he saw Garcia once again, and the two began arguing. Police said that this is when Garcia shot Guadelupe twice in the back, just as he was trying to leave. Detectives found Guadalupe's body in the backyard of the home, along with the bullet casings and a witness who would not cooperate. Deputies stopped Garcia for a traffic violation nearly 3 months later and found a 9mm pistol in his vehicle. Garcia was arrested for possessing a firearm as a felon. Testing was done on the gun by Florida Department of Law Enforcement that ultimately linked the gun to the crime scene. But the rounds that Guadalupe was shot with came from a different weapon, detectives found. Detectives continued to investigate the fatal shooting, talking to different witnesses who said Garcia spoke about taking Guadalupe's life. In 2015, Garcia admitted to another inmate at the Manatee County Jail, even providing details about what happened that night, according to detectives. But the detectives were not told about the conversation until 2022. On January 9th of 2023, detectives obtained an arrest warrant for Garcia, who was located at a home on 30th Avenue West and taken into custody. He was out on bond for an unrelated case. The detectives said it was possible Garcia was connected to other unsolved violent crimes dating back to the mid-2000s, and they asked anyone with information to call the Manatee County Sheriff's Office at 941-747-3011 or Manatee Crime Stoppers at 866-634-8477. 29-year-old Mary Mathis Davis was last seen at Lanier's Hardware in Lexington, North Carolina, where she worked on May 30th of 1987. She worked for a brief period before failing to return after her lunch break. The next day, investigators found her body behind a Winn-Dixie store on East Center Street. She had been strangled and assaulted. Mary's husband, Richard Davis, recalled the last time that he saw her. "I seen her that morning and I went to my sister's swimming, and when we came back, we thought she would be home from work by then," said Richard. Investigators collected DNA belonging to the culprit from Mary's body. The DNA only became useful recently with advancements in DNA technology. Othram Inc. used forensic evidence to identify Russell Grant Wood as the person that took Mary's life. The announcement was made on February 3rd of 2023. Russell Wood, who was a Lexington resident, passed away in 2013. Police said he did not have a previous record. Investigators said that Mary Davis and Wood were acquaintances but did not know each other well. Mary Davis's daughter, Tracy Cleary, was 1 year old when her mother's life was taken. "I've always heard that she was kind and sweet, and that she had a lot of patience, and she just liked people," said Cleary. She said she is relieved by the department's discovery because it brings closure and clears her father's name. "I think it was more relief that all these things my whole life, that I maybe have thought about or what it could be, it was all proven," said Cleary. Police said they don't know what Wood's motive would have been, but if he was still alive, he would definitely be charged with taking Mary's life, kidnapping her, and assaulting her. On January 17th of 2013, Trina Butler-Turner was reported missing in East St. Louis, Illinois by her relatives after she was last seen getting into a red pickup truck. 40-year-old Trina was a mother of 3 and had previously worked as a housekeeper. For many years, Trina's family and friends wondered what had happened to their loved one. Then, on December 5th of 2022, skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area along Route 111 in Pontoon Beach, Illinois. DNA samples were extracted and sent to be tested. 2 days later, DNA confirmed the remains belonged to Trina Butler-Turner. It was also determined that she had been strangled and beaten. Then, on February 2nd of 2023, charges were announced against 55-year-old Roger Sutton Jr. and his nephew, 32-year-old Nathan Bayer. Both men were charged with the concealment of a body. Sutton Jr. was also charged with taking Trina's life. The relationship between Trina and the men is not yet known. Investigators have also not made public what led them to Sutton Jr. and Bayer. Madison County State's Attorney Thomas Hain said Trina was a beloved daughter and a mother. She was last seen 10 years ago when her family reported her missing, Hain said. But today, we can now say, due to extraordinary police work, we have found Trina's body, and we believe her life was taken, and we believe we found those responsible. The investigation is still ongoing. Anyone with information should contact the Pontoon Beach Police Department at 618-931-5100. 40-year-old Julie Carol Jensen lived in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin in 1998. She lived with her husband, Mark Jensen, and their 2 children. Mark and Julie met in 1981 while she was working at a Sears department store in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. They were both students at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside in Kenosha. The couple moved to the Carroll Beach neighborhood of Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, and had 2 children, David and Douglas. By 1998, Julie worked a part-time job for the Port Authority in Chicago, while Mark was employed as a branch manager of the Racine, Wisconsin branch of a St. Louis-based financial firm. On December 3rd of 1998, Mark contacted law enforcement and claimed that Julie passed away in her sleep. Investigators discovered traces of ethylene glycol in her system. Ethylene glycol is a hard-to-detect poison found in antifreeze. Police then found a letter Julie wrote before she met her end. This is what was written in the letter. "I took this picture, and I am writing this on Saturday, November 21st, 1998 at 7 a.m. This list was in my husband's business daily planner. Not meant for me to see. I don't know what it means, but if anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect. Our relationship has deteriorated to the polite, superficial one. I know he's never forgiven me for the brief affair I had with that creep 7 years ago. Mark lives for work and the kids. He's an avid surfer of the internet. Anyway, I do not smoke or drink. My mother was an alcoholic, so I limit my drinking to 1 or 2 a week. Mark wants me to drink more with him in the evenings. I don't. I would never take my life because of my kids. They are everything to me. I regularly take Tylenol and multivitamins, occasionally take over-the-counter stuff for colds, Zantac, or Imodium, have 1 prescription for migraine tablets, which Mark uses more than I. I pray that I am wrong and nothing happens, but I am suspicious of Mark's suspicious behaviors and fear of my early demise. However, I will not leave David and Douglas, my life's greatest love, accomplishment, and wish. My 3 Ds, Daddy, David, and Douglas. Julie's family and loved ones remember her gentle, carefree, and easygoing nature. She was described as warm, caring, and sincere, who was somewhat quiet but enjoyed being with people. The following decade, investigators tried to build a concrete case against Mark Jensen. A lengthy trial then ensued. In 2008, Special Prosecutor Robert Jambois contended that Mark Jensen poisoned his wife with ethylene glycol and then suffocated her while she was barely breathing in their marital bed on December 3rd of 1998. Defense counsel Craig Albee argued that Julie Jensen was a depressed woman who took her own life and framed her husband. Moreover, Julie had seen a therapist at least 3 times for depression. Evidence was introduced showing that Mark Jensen had discussed poisoning his wife with coworkers and a jailhouse associate. Going through his home computer, evidence was found that he searched on the internet for information relating to poison. The letter that Julie wrote was the critical factor in the trial that ended on February 22nd of 2008. The jury found 48-year-old Mark Jensen guilty after more than 30 hours of deliberations. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. On December 9th of 2013, a federal judge overturned Jensen's conviction and ordered he be released from prison within 90 days. The court agreed with Jensen's argument that the state's use of his deceased wife's words violated his constitutional rights to confront witnesses testifying against him. 63-year-old Mark Jensen stood for trial a second time starting on January 9th of 2023. He was found guilty on February 1st, 2023. Mark Jensen, who now faces life in prison, will be sentenced April 14th of 2023. He remained expressionless when the verdict was read.